There is a moment just before you fully wake when the world has not yet decided what it is. The ceiling above you could be the ceiling of your room or the ceiling of some other room entirely, some room your mind invented out of habit and expectation, and for a half second, maybe less, you do not know which one you are looking at. Most people let that half second pass without a thought. It closes like a door closing on its own weight, and the day begins, and nobody asks what just happened in that gap. But some people don't let it close. Some people stand in the doorway and look back. This is the story of a man who stood in the doorway and never quite let it close again. His name doesn't matter, not really, though if it helps to have one, call him Illy. He was not a philosopher. He had never read a page of Descartes in his life, had no interest in epistemology, had never lain awake wondering whether the external world existed. He was, before all this started, a perfectly ordinary man with a job that involved spreadsheets and a habit of falling asleep with the television on. What happened to him could happen to anyone, which is precisely what makes it worth telling. This was not a man seeking wisdom. This was a man who woke up one night convinced he hadn't actually woken up at all, and who then made the mistake or the discovery, depending on how you look at it, of taking that feeling seriously. Before that night, Illy's life had the particular shape of a life that has never once been examined in the way that most lives, most of the time, never are. He got up at the same hour most mornings, made coffee the same way, drove the same route to an office where he built forecasts out of numbers other people would later argue about in meetings he mostly tuned out. He had a sister he loved without ever quite finding the occasion to say so directly. He had a habit of falling asleep to the low murmur of the television, some rerun he'd already seen a dozen times because the familiar noise made the silence of the house easier to sleep through. None of this was remarkable, and Illy had never wanted it to be. He was not a man who went looking for depths. If anything, he had spent most of his adult life gently, comfortably avoiding them, the way a person avoids a particular pothole on a familiar road without ever quite deciding to, simply because the wheel has learned the swerve. Whatever it was that finally caught him, bad sleep, some unremembered dream, the specific alignment of an ordinary Tuesday night, it caught a man with absolutely no defenses prepared against it, which is perhaps why it hit as hard as it did. It began, as these things often do, with nothing. He woke at 3:14 in the morning, the way people sometimes do for no reason anyone has ever adequately explained, and he lay there in the dark listening to the house settle around him, and he had the passing thought, what if this is a dream? It was not a profound thought. It was the kind of idle, half-formed notion that drifts through a tired mind and is usually gone before it finishes forming. Most nights he would have rolled over and been asleep again in 90 seconds, the thought dissolved and forgotten, filed away with all the other 3 a.m. nonsense the brain generates and discards. But that night, for reasons he could never afterward reconstruct, the thought did not dissolve. It sat there in the dark with him. What if this is a dream? He tried the obvious things first because obvious things are what an untrained mind reaches for. He pinched the skin on the back of his hand hard enough to leave a small red crescent, and felt the sting of it, sharp and immediate, and thought, there, that settles it, pain like that doesn't happen in dreams. Except that even as he thought it, some quieter part of him objected. He remembered, or believed he remembered, a dream from years earlier in which he had fallen from a great height and felt the impact in his chest, the full physical shock of it, real enough that he had woken gasping. If a dream could manufacture the sensation of a body breaking against pavement, could it not just as easily manufacture the small sting of a pinch? The test he trusted instantly fell apart in his hands. He lay there feeling slightly foolish, and slightly more awake than before, in the way that unease tends to sharpen the senses rather than dull them. He tried counting his fingers next, an old trick he half remembered from somewhere, the idea being that hands render strangely in dreams, extra fingers or missing ones, digits that blur or multiply if you look too closely. He held his hand up in the dark and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He counted again, more slowly this time, tracing each finger with the thumb of his other hand as though touch could correct what sight might miss. 5 again. It proved nothing, and he knew it proved nothing even as he did it, for the same reason everything else had proved nothing, a mind that could build a whole convincing bedroom around him, the specific weight of the blanket, the specific hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away, could certainly manage to keep a hand at 5 fingers if 5 fingers was what it had decided this particular fiction required. He was beginning to notice a pattern in his own reasoning, the way each test he reached for came preloaded with some folk claim about how dreams supposedly betray themselves, and how each of those claims, on inspection, turned out to be something he had absorbed passively rather than verified, a rumor mistaken for a rule. He thought about phoning someone. It was nearly 4 in the morning by then, too late to call anyone decent, but he thought about it anyway, turning the idea over. If he called his sister and she answered, and her voice sounded like her voice, and she said something only she would say, wouldn't that settle it? Wouldn't an external, independent confirmation from another mind be exactly the kind of check his own faculties couldn't provide alone? He got as far as picking up his phone before the objection arrived, quieter this time, almost bored with itself. If this were a dream, his sister's voice on the other end would be manufactured by the same mind manufacturing everything else, saying exactly what his sleeping mind expected her to say, because there would be no actual phone line running out of the dream into an actual separate person. The whole call, ringtone and all, would simply be one more object inside the same enclosed fiction. An imagined confirmation is not a confirmation. He put the phone down without dialing. He tried the clock on the nightstand, another rumor, this one claiming that digital numbers are unstable in dreams the way text supposedly is, that if you look away and look back the numbers will have jumped or scrambled in some manner impossible for real time to produce. He watched the numbers for a full minute, 1 uninterrupted minute by his own count, and they advanced normally, 358 becoming 359 becoming 400, orderly and mechanical, and this too proved nothing because he had no idea whether the claim about clocks was even true to begin with, and because, again, a mind sophisticated enough to build the room could presumably manage a clock that counted correctly. He noticed somewhere around here that he had stopped expecting the tests to work. He was running through them less because he believed any of them would settle the matter and more because doing something, anything, felt marginally better than lying still with the question unanswered. That, too, he recognized, some vague and distant part of his mind supplying the recognition almost against his will. A person doing something out of restlessness rather than conviction is a person who has already, on some level, admitted the tests have failed. He went to the bathroom and turned on the light. The floor was cold under his feet, appropriately, believably cold, the kind of cold that argued for itself. He walked to the window and looked out at the street, at the sodium light making its familiar orange stain on the pavement, at the shape of the Henderson's car parked crooked against the curb the way it always was because Mrs. Henderson could not parallel park to save her life. Everything was exactly where it should be, which, he realized with a small jolt, was itself no proof of anything. Of course everything was where it should be. If his mind were generating this scene, it would generate it out of memory, and memory was precisely where the crooked car and the orange light lived. A forgery does not announce itself by getting the details wrong. A good forgery gets the details exactly right because the details are all it has to work with, and the person being deceived is the only source those details ever came from in the first place. He went to the bathroom and turned on the light, and here he tried something he had heard about once, in passing, from some article or video. He could no longer place the idea that written text behaves strangely in dreams, that you can read a word, look away, look back, and find it changed because the dreaming mind cannot hold a fixed string of language steady the way the waking mind can. There was a bottle of aspirin on the shelf. He read the label. Then he closed his eyes, counted to 5, opened them, and read it again. The word was the same both times. He felt a brief surge of relief, and then, almost immediately, the same quiet objection rose up to meet it. How would he know if his dreaming mind were sophisticated enough to keep the label consistent? He had never actually tested this claim about dream text under controlled conditions. He only half remembered hearing it somewhere, secondhand, possibly wrong, possibly a piece of folk psychology with no real grounding at all. And even if the claim were true in general, true of dreams on average, it would prove nothing about this particular moment, because this particular moment, if it was a dream, might simply be an unusually stable one. A test that can fail silently is not a test. It is a habit dressed up as evidence. He tried a light switch next, flicking it on and off, some other rumor rattling around in his memory that lights don't behave correctly in dreams, that they flicker or fail to fully illuminate a room or produce some effect the mind can't quite render. The bathroom light came on crisp and full each time, a clean white flood that made him squint. It proved nothing, and by now he knew it proved nothing before he'd even finished the thought. Every test he could think of relied on the assumption that his dreaming mind was somehow less capable than his waking mind, cruder, glitchier, unable to sustain a consistent fiction. But he had no actual reason to believe that. He had simply absorbed the idea somewhere, the way people absorb thousands of unexamined ideas, and had never once stopped to ask whether it held up. Standing in his bathroom at nearly 4 in the morning, running his thumb along the cold edge of the sink, he found that it did not hold up. A mind that could construct this entire scene, the pattern of grout between the tiles, the particular hum of the exhaust fan, the smell of the soap, the ache starting to build behind his eyes from being awake this long, a mind capable of all that was surely capable of keeping a word spelled consistently or a light switch working the way it should. This is usually the point where a person gives up. The tests fail, the reassurance doesn't arrive, and the mind, tired and unsatisfied, simply decides to move on because there is nothing else productive to do with a doubt that won't resolve. Illy almost did this. He stood in his bathroom telling himself it didn't matter, that he was awake because he was clearly awake, that the very fact he was capable of standing here interrogating the question was itself a kind of proof, and for about a minute this worked, the way a shrug works on almost anything. Then he caught the flaw in it immediately. Of course a dream character can interrogate a question. Of course a dream character can stand in a fictional bathroom telling himself he's awake. That's exactly what a dream character would do if the dream required him to feel convinced. The feeling of certainty is not evidence of the thing it's certain about. He had confused the volume of a conviction with its truth, and once he saw that confusion clearly, he could not unsee it. The days that followed were, by any outside measure, entirely unremarkable. He went to work. He sat through a meeting about a budget forecast, nodded at the appropriate places, ate a sandwich at his desk, drove home in the ordinary evening traffic with the ordinary frustration of a light that stayed red too long. But underneath the routine, something had started running that hadn't been running before, a kind of background process he couldn't switch off, a low continuous hum of the same question replaying itself against the grain of every ordinary moment. He would be pouring cereal and catch himself thinking, how would I actually know, that this bowl is a bowl? He would be shaking a colleague's hand and think for a flickering half-second he was almost ashamed of, that the warmth and pressure of it proved nothing more than the pinch had proved. He wasn't frightened exactly, not in those ordinary daylight moments. The fear mostly belonged to the nights. In the daylight it was closer to a kind of static, a faint interference pattern laid over everything, impossible to fully ignore and impossible to resolve. He started, without really deciding to, keeping the notebook by his bed for more than just counting nights. He began writing down the tests as he thought of them, and beside each one, in a second column, he added almost as an afterthought, the reason it failed. Pinch, dreams can contain pain. Text claim unverified, and a sufficiently good fiction would pass anyway. Light switch, same objection. Fingers, same. phone call, any confirmation from another person would itself be manufactured by the same process manufacturing everything else. Troc unverified claim, same structural flaw as text. Looking down the list one evening, he noticed something that unsettled him more than any single test had on its own. Every failure had exactly the same shape. It wasn't that he kept picking bad tests by accident, the way you might keep picking the wrong key from a ring by clumsiness. It was that there was something structurally wrong with the entire category of test he was reaching for, something no cleverer test from the same family would ever be able to fix, because every test he could imagine relied on using some piece of the experience itself to check the reliability of the experience as a whole, and a piece of a system can never independently verify the system it's a piece of. It was like trying to check whether a ruler is accurate by measuring it with itself. He was on the verge, more than once during that stretch, of simply letting it go the way he had let go of 100 other unresolved 3 a.m. thoughts over the course of his life, not because he'd found an answer, but because unresolved questions, left alone long enough, usually just lose their grip and drift off, the way a splinter eventually works its own way out if you stop pressing on it. And this one might have drifted off too, might have joined the long list of things he'd once found strange and later simply forgot to keep finding strange if his coworker hadn't mentioned, over that lunch, the name of a 400-year-old book that turned out to already contain, laid out with far more discipline than Illy had managed on his own, the exact shape of the hole he'd fallen into. He went back to bed, not because he'd resolved anything, but because there was nowhere else to take the question, and he lay in the dark running through the shape of what had just happened to him. He had wanted a test. He had reached for pain, and pain had failed him, because dreams can contain pain. He had reached for the stability of written words, and that had failed him too, both because he wasn't sure the premise was even true and because a sufficiently good dream would simply pass the test by being sufficiently good. He had reached for the ordinary behavior of a light switch, and that had failed for the same reason. Every test shared a single fatal weakness. Each one assumed that dreams were somehow lesser than waking life, cruder, less internally consistent, easier to catch out, and he had no way of actually establishing that assumption. He was trying to use the contents of the dream to prove he wasn't dreaming, and the contents of the dream, if it was a dream, would always cooperate with the dream's own logic. A prisoner cannot use the walls of his cell to prove there is no cell. 3 nights later, and he counted them, 3 nights, because after that first night he began keeping a kind of ledger in a notebook he'd started leaving on the nightstand. He found the shape of what he'd stumbled into. He was not, it turned out, the first person to stumble into it. He mentioned the strange sleepless week to a coworker over lunch, half joking, expecting to be laughed at, and instead the coworker, a quiet man from the floor above who read paperbacks on his breaks, said something that changed the trajectory of the whole thing. "That's just Descartes," the man said, not unkindly. "First meditation. He worked through basically that exact problem 400 years ago. You should read it. It's short." What the coworker didn't mention, and what Illy only discovered later, sitting in the library on his lunch break scrolling through what he could find, was that Descartes hadn't invented the doubt out of nothing either. The suspicion that waking life might be indistinguishable from a dream was, it turned out, one of the oldest recurring itches in the whole history of human thought, cropping up again and again in places that had no contact with one another, as though the doubt were less an idea any one person had and more a hole in the floor that any sufficiently careful walker was eventually going to find. There was a story from ancient China, centuries before Descartes, about a philosopher named Yuanzi who dreamed he was a butterfly, fluttering about, perfectly content, with no awareness at all that he was a man dreaming, and who woke and found himself, apparently, a man again, solid and specific, and then could not shake the question of which was the more fundamental fact, a man who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming that it was a man. There were the ancient Greek skeptics too, a whole tradition of them, people who had made an entire discipline out of exactly this kind of doubt, arguing that because the senses could be shown to disagree with themselves under different conditions, the honest response was to suspend judgment altogether rather than commit to any claim about how things really stood beneath appearances. Illy found himself oddly comforted by this, in a way he hadn't expected to be. He had assumed, those first few nights, that he'd broken something in himself, stumbled into some private, disordered corner of his own mind that no reasonable person would ever wander into. Instead, it turned out he had walked, clumsily and by accident, into a room that a great many careful people, across a great many centuries and cultures with no way of comparing notes, had all separately found their way into and found genuinely difficult to walk back out of. Illy had never heard of Descartes' meditations. He knew the name the way most people know it, attached vaguely to a phrase about thinking and being that gets printed on coffee mugs and nothing more. That evening he found a copy, an old translation, the language a little stiff and formal, sentences that unfolded slowly and demanded to be reread, and he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and read the opening pages and felt something close to vertigo. Here was a man, centuries dead, sitting at his own table in his own version of this exact predicament, working through the exact same collapse Illy had stumbled into alone in his bathroom at 4 in the morning. Descartes had set himself a project to see whether there was anything at all he could believe with total certainty, anything immune to even the smallest possible doubt, and to do this properly he had decided he would need to doubt everything that could be doubted, no matter how secure it felt, and build back up from whatever, if anything, survived. Descartes began exactly where Illy had begun, with the senses. He noted that the senses had deceived him before. A tower that looked round from a distance turns out to be square up close, and all half submerged in water looks bent though it is straight, and that anything which has deceived you once is not fully trustworthy afterward. But this alone was a fairly modest doubt, easily managed, because most sensory errors only apply to things far away or seen under bad conditions. It didn't touch the more immediate claims that he was sitting there, in that room, in a robe, holding a piece of paper by the fire. Surely those things, at least, were beyond doubt. And it was here that Descartes reached for the very door Illy had already stood in. Unless, he wrote, I am comparing myself to madmen whose brains are so disturbed that they firmly maintain they are kings when they are paupers, or that they are dressed in purple when they are naked. But he set that comparison aside too quickly for it to satisfy him, because there was a subtler and far more disturbing possibility waiting behind it, one that applied to sane people too, one that applied to everyone, every single night. How often, he wrote, has it happened to me that in the night I dreamt that I was in this particular place, dressed, sitting near the fire, when in fact I was lying undressed in bed. Right now, it certainly seems to me that it is with waking eyes that I am looking at this paper, that this head I am shaking is not asleep, that I extend my hand consciously and deliberately, and I feel it. What happens in sleep does not seem so clear or so distinct as all this. But in thinking this over, I remind myself that on many occasions I have been deceived by similar illusions in my dreams, and dwelling on this more carefully, I see so clearly that there is no certain way of distinguishing being awake from being asleep that I am quite astonished, and my astonishment is such that it is almost able to persuade me that I am dreaming now. Illy read that paragraph 3 times. Almost able to persuade me that I am dreaming now. This was, word for word, feeling for feeling, exactly what had happened to him in the bathroom with the light switch. Descartes had not found the answer. He had found the same trap, the same impossibility of using the tools inside the dream to prove there was no dream, and rather than shrugging it off, he had walked straight into the center of it and declared it a real problem worth taking seriously. He was not being clever for the sake of cleverness. He genuinely could not find the seam where waking life stopped resembling dreams closely enough to be told apart with confidence. And what struck Illy most, sitting at his kitchen table with the coffee now fully cold, was the calm, procedural tone of the writing. Descartes was not panicking. He was working. He had turned the vertigo Illy felt into a method, a discipline, a deliberate demolition of every belief that couldn't hold its own weight in order to see what, if anything, remained standing at the end of it. Illy kept reading, and the demolition kept going, and it got worse before it got anywhere near better. Because even granting that the entire scene around him, the fire, the paper, the hand he could feel himself extending, might be nothing more than the furniture of an elaborate dream, there still seemed to be a flaw beneath the flaw. Even in dreams, Descartes reasoned, certain very general and simple things must be built from something real, the way a painter, however wildly he mixes and invents when composing a picture of a creature no one has ever seen, cannot invent wholly new colors, only new arrangements of colors that already exist. So even if all the particular things in his experience, the fire, the table, the paper, were illusions, surely something more basic had to be real in order for the illusion to be built at all. Things like shape and quantity and extension in space and number, the sort of raw material that even fictions have to borrow from somewhere. Physics, astronomy, medicine, these dealt with composite, particular things, and so were suspect, since composite, particular things were exactly what a dream traffics in. But arithmetic, geometry, and other subjects of this kind, which deal only with the simplest and most general things, and are indifferent as to whether these things exist in nature or not, contain something certain and indubitable. For whether I am awake or asleep, 2 and 3 added together are 5, and a square has no more than 4 sides, and it does not seem possible that such transparent truths can be suspected of any falsity. Later in the book, in a passage that had nothing directly to do with dreams or demons but that lodged itself in Illy's mind almost as firmly as the arguments that did, Descartes turned his attention to a piece of wax fresh from the honeycomb, still smelling faintly of flowers, firm and cold and giving a small sound when tapped. He then held it near the fire and watched what happened to it. The smell vanished, the taste vanished, the color changed, the shape ran and lost every edge it had held a moment before. The sound it made when struck disappeared entirely. Every single quality his senses had originally used to identify the wax as wax had now changed or vanished outright. And yet, he noted, no one would say it had stopped being wax. Everyone would agree it was the very same piece, only melted. Which meant, he reasoned, that whatever it was that made the wax, whatever persisted underneath the shifting parade of smell and color and shape and sound, was not something the senses had ever actually grasped at all. The senses had only ever caught the surface, the accidents, the qualities that came and went, while the wax itself, its being extended, flexible, and changeable, was something the mind understood and judged, not something the eyes or the nose or the fingers had ever directly touched. Illy read this passage 3 or 4 times before it landed properly, and when it did, it unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected a piece of melting candle wax to manage. If the senses couldn't even reliably deliver something as mundane and present as a lump of wax sitting on a table in front of him, if what he actually perceived of the wax was never more than a shifting surface that his mind had to interpret and stitch together into an object, then the senses had never been doing quite what he'd always assumed they were doing. He had always pictured perception as something like a window, a transparent pane through which the world simply came in, unaltered, direct. The wax suggested something closer to a translator standing at the window, one whose translations he had never once had the opportunity to check against the original. For a moment, reading this, Illy felt a kind of relief on Descartes' behalf, the sense of a man finding solid rock at last after all that digging. 2 + 3 is 5. A square has 4 sides. Surely dreaming or waking made no difference to that. And it was here, precisely at the point where Descartes seemed to have found his flaw, that he pulled the flaw out from under himself entirely, and it was this move, more than the dream argument, more than anything before it, that made the room around Illy feel suddenly colder, though he knew, or thought he knew, that nothing in the actual temperature of the kitchen had changed. Descartes' next move was to imagine something worse than a dream. A dream, after all, was still his own mind misfiring in its own familiar way, and there was something almost comforting in that, the way it's less frightening to be lost in your own house than in someone else's. But what if the deception went deeper than that? What if there existed, he proposed, not a beneficent God as the source of all things, as he had long assumed, but instead an evil genius, not less powerful than deceitful, who had employed all his energies in order to deceive him? He would suppose that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all other external things were nothing but delusions and dreams which this evil genius had used as traps for his credulity. He would consider himself as having no hands, no eyes, no flesh, no blood, no senses at all, and yet as falsely believing that he possessed all these things. Even the mathematics, the 2 plus 3, the four-sided square, was not safe from this, because a being clever and powerful enough to fabricate the entire physical universe inside his mind could just as easily be tampering with his reasoning itself, feeding him the false conviction that 2 and 3 make 5 every single time he calculated it, so that the error felt from the inside exactly like the truth. There would be no way to catch the trick, because the very faculty he would use to catch it, his own reasoning, might itself be the thing that had been corrupted. What struck Illy, reading further, was that Descartes hadn't reached for the demon out of some morbid taste for despair. He had reached for it deliberately as a piece of method, almost the way a person stress tests a bridge by loading it with more weight than it will ever actually have to bear in ordinary use, not because they expect the bridge to carry that weight in practice, but because a bridge that survives the extreme case can be trusted in every milder one beneath it. Descartes wanted to find at least one belief that could survive the worst possible adversary imaginable, an adversary with unlimited power and unlimited motive to deceive, precisely so that whatever did survive would never again need to be checked against any lesser doubt. It was, in its way, an oddly optimistic project disguised as a pessimistic one, not doubt for the sake of despair, but doubt as the most demanding possible filter, built to let through only what could not, under any circumstance, be filtered out. Illy found himself almost admiring the discipline of it, even as the content of it kept him up long past any hour discipline alone could account for. It was one thing to have a stray frightening thought at 4 in the morning. It was another thing entirely to build an entire deliberate method out of chasing that thought as far as it could possibly go, on purpose, with a clear head, in the middle of the afternoon, by the fire, and to trust that something worthwhile would be waiting on the other side of it. Illy set the book down at this point and sat very still for a while. The evil genius, the deceiver, it was not, he understood, a claim that such a being actually existed. Descartes said so directly, it was a supposition, a deliberate exercise, a hypothesis adopted purely as a tool, in order to see whether anything at all could survive being doubted this aggressively. But as a tool it was terrifying precisely because of how complete it was. The dream argument had only threatened the immediate scene around him, this room, this body, this fire. The demon argument threatened everything, including the laws of logic and mathematics themselves, including the very sense of what following an argument correctly even felt like. If a being existed who could make 2 plus 3 equal 5 feel just as certain as 2 plus 3 equaling 5 actually is, then certainty itself, the feeling of certainty, was worthless as a guide to truth, because it could be manufactured, indistinguishable from the real thing, in exactly the way a forged signature is manufactured to be indistinguishable from a real one by someone who has studied the original closely enough. He tried, the next evening, to talk about it with his sister, the same sister he had almost called at 4 in the morning weeks earlier. They were sitting on her porch, the ordinary warm evening, the kind of thing that made the whole conversation feel slightly absurd even as he was having it, and he explained it as best he could, the dream tests, the failures, the book, the demon, expecting her to laugh, or worse, to look at him the way you look at someone you're starting to worry about. She didn't laugh. She sat with it for a moment, turning her glass of iced tea slowly on the armrest, and said something that stayed with him longer than almost anything in the book itself. So what would it even feel like, she asked, if he was right? Being deceived about everything. What would that actually feel like from the inside? And Lily, turning the question over, realized with a small cold jolt that the honest answer was it would feel exactly like this. Exactly like sitting on this porch in this ordinary evening light having this ordinary conversation with his sister. A total deception, if it were good enough to be total, would not announce itself with strangeness. It would announce itself with nothing at all. It would feel like Tuesday. That was, he came to think later, the truly unbearable part of the demon, not that it was frightening in the way a monster is frightening, but that it was completely compatible with everything, looking and feeling perfectly fine forever, with no seam anywhere for a person to catch it by. He thought about the demon that night lying in bed, and it did something the dream argument alone had not managed to do. It made him afraid in a low, persistent way that had nothing to do with any specific danger and everything to do with the sudden absence of a flaw. If a dream could deceive him about where he was, and a demon could deceive him about whether 2 and 3 made 5, then what, if anything, was actually left? What could a mind hold on to once every possible foothold, the senses, the body, mathematics, logic itself, had been placed under suspicion? He lay there turning the question over and over, the way you turn a stone over looking for the dry side, and could not find one. Everything he reached for, the demon could have planted. Every certainty he tried to lean on could, in principle, be exactly the kind of certainty a sufficiently powerful deceiver would manufacture to keep the deception seamless. It occurred to him, somewhere near 2 in the morning, that this was probably the most frightening thought he had ever had, and that the most frightening thing about it wasn't any particular content, it wasn't ghosts or death or falling, it was the total absence of an edge to stand on while thinking it. That was the worst night of the whole stretch, worse even than the first one, and Illy remembers it more clearly than almost any other night of that year, the way you remember the specific texture of a fever rather than the illness in general. He got up at some point, unable to lie still with it any longer, and walked through the dark house the way he had that first night, except this time nothing in the house offered even the flimsy reassurance the pinch and the light switch had once briefly provided, because he already knew, walking through it, exactly how little those tests were worth. He stood in his kitchen with the refrigerator humming its familiar hum and found himself doing something he was faintly embarrassed by even in the moment, speaking out loud, quietly, to the empty room, not quite a prayer and not quite nothing, something closer to a request addressed to no one in particular, asking whatever might be listening, demon or God or simply the ordinary universe, to just let this be real, to let the floor hold. Nothing answered, of course, which he had expected, and which somehow made it worse rather than better, because even the silence, he realized with a small bitter laugh at his own expense, was exactly what a total deception would produce. A demon skilled enough to fabricate a convincing sky would hardly be undone by a man asking it politely to stop. He sat down on the kitchen floor, his back against the cabinet beneath the sink, and stayed there for a long time, long enough that the black outside the window began, eventually, to soften toward grey. He was not thinking anymore, not in any organized way, he was simply enduring the shape of the fear, the way you endure weather. And it was somewhere in that long, thoughtless stretch of sitting on the cold floor, well past the point of trying to solve anything, that the beginning of the answer arrived, not as an argument, not yet, but as a single, stubborn, almost animal fact that refused to be talked away no matter how far the doubt was pushed. Whatever this was, awful and disorienting as it felt, something was feeling it. Something was sitting on this floor, whatever the floor ultimately turned out to be, made of being afraid. He did not yet have Descartes' careful language for it. He only had the fact itself, raw and unphilosophical, sitting there with him in the dark. The fear was happening to someone, and that someone, whatever it was, could not be nothing, or there would be no fear for it to happen to. And then, almost by accident, in the middle of that particular kind of despair, he found the edge. or rather he read the next morning how Descartes had found it, and the discovery landed on him with a force that the earlier passages hadn't quite prepared him for, because it was so small, so almost embarrassingly simple, that it seemed impossible it could bear the weight being placed on it. Descartes had reasoned as follows. Suppose the demon is real. Suppose it is deceiving me about literally everything, the sky, the earth, my own body, the truths of mathematics, all of it, every single input and every single inference corrupted from the ground up with total and perfect skill. Even granting all of that, granting the very worst case imaginable, there remains one thing the demon cannot touch because the demon's deception depends on it. In order to be deceived at all, something has to exist that is doing the being deceived. The demon can make me believe false things about the world, but he cannot make it false that I, whatever I am the one believing them. If I am doubting, then a doubting is occurring. If I am being deceived, then a deceived thing exists to be the target of the deception. The demon can fabricate a sky I don't actually see and a body I don't actually have, but he cannot fabricate the fact of my thinking without that thinking actually taking place, because the very act of fabricating a false thought in me is itself an act of thinking happening in me. So let him deceive me as much as he can, he will never bring it about that I am nothing so long as I think that I am something. So that after weighing everything up thoroughly and carefully enough, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I express it or conceive it in my mind. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Illy read that sentence, then read it again, and felt something shift, though it took him a while to identify what exactly had shifted, because at first it seemed like far too small a thing to have caused it. The demon had taken everything else, the room, the body, the fire, the mathematics, the whole architecture of the external world, gone, all of it, potentially fictional, potentially fabricated by a hostile intelligence with perfect skill. But the very act of the demon deceiving him required that there be a him there to receive the deception. You cannot successfully trick something that isn't there to be tricked. The doubting itself, the very activity Illy had been engaged in all week, lying awake pinching his own arm and flicking light switches and reading and rereading a bottle of aspirin, that activity, whatever else was true or false about its contents, was itself undeniable proof that some thinking thing was doing it. Not proof that he had hands. Not proof that he had a body at all, or a history, or a name, or a room with a window looking out at the Hendersons' crooked car. Just proof of the bare, minimal fact that something was thinking, right now, in this instant, and that this something therefore existed, at least as a thinker, at least for as long as the thinking continued. It was, he came to feel over the following days, less like a solution and more like a single fixed point in an otherwise disintegrating universe, not a wall you could build a house against, but a single nail driven into the wall of an otherwise collapsing structure, from which, if you were careful and patient enough, you might eventually try to hang something else. It did not tell him whether he had a body. It did not tell him whether the world outside his thoughts existed at all, or whether it existed as he perceived it, or whether there even was an outside in any meaningful sense. It told him only this, that there was a thinking going on, and that wherever there is thinking, there must be a thing doing the thinking, and that this much, at least, could not be doubted away, because the doubting was itself an instance of the very thing being doubted. Every attempt to deny it only performed it again. He tried, almost as a game, lying in bed one night, to doubt that he existed, to really try, with full seriousness, to convince himself there was no thinking thing behind his thoughts, and found that the attempt itself was the proof standing in his way, over and over, an obstacle that could not be removed because removing it required using it. He noticed, in the days that followed, that the cogito was a much narrower victory than it first appeared to be, and that it was worth being precise about exactly how narrow, because it was tempting, and he caught himself doing it more than once, to smuggle more into it than it actually contained. It did not prove that Illy existed, not in the fuller sense of that word, not the Illy with a name, a childhood, a sister, a job involving spreadsheets, a body that had once broken an arm falling off a bicycle at age 9. All of that biographical weight, all of that history and identity belonged to the very category of thing the demon had already been given license to fabricate. What the argument actually secured was thinner and stranger than a person, not I, Illy, exists, but something closer to a thinking is occurring, and wherever a thinking occurs, there must be something for it to be occurring in or as. He read, later, that a philosopher named Lichtenberg had made almost exactly this objection a century after Descartes, arguing that Descartes had been entitled to say only there is thinking going on, not I think, because the leap from an occurring thought to a persisting, unified I who owns that thought and will still be there to own the next one was itself an assumption the argument hadn't actually earned. Illy sat with that a long time, because it seemed to matter more than it should have for something so abstract. If even nigh of I think, therefore I was doing more work than the bare fact of thinking could support, if all that had truly been secured was a thought occurring, with no guarantee of a stable, continuous someone behind it, no guarantee that the thinker of this thought was the same thinker who would think the next one, then the flaw he had found was even smaller than he'd first believed. Not a person, not even a self, in any fixed sense. Just an occurrence, bare and momentary, verified only for the instant it was happening, with nothing beyond that instant standing surety for the next. This last part troubled him more than he expected once he'd sat with it long enough to feel its full weight. If the certainty only ever covered the instant of thinking and nothing beyond it, then the he who had been reassured a moment ago was not, strictly, guaranteed to be the same he doing the worrying about it now. Each fresh instant of thought arrived with its own small, isolated proof of itself, and expired, and had to be earned again by whatever came next. He found himself picturing it on one of the long nights when sleep wasn't coming anyway as something like a chain of tiny lit matches, each one flaring into certain undeniable existence for as long as it burned and then going dark with no promise built into any single match that another would follow it, and no way for one match, however brightly it burned, to vouch for the next one before it existed. It was a strange, thin way to think of a self, and it unsettled the ordinary, comfortable sense he'd always had of being one continuous person moving through time, the same Illy who had skinned his knee at 9 and would, presumably, still be Illy decades from now. The cogito had never promised him that continuity. It had only ever promised him this, that whatever was thinking, right now, in this particular instant, undeniably existed for as long as the thinking lasted. Everything else, the persistence, the name, the whole stitched-together story of a life, was scaffolding built up around that bare flare of certainty, useful and probably necessary scaffolding, but scaffolding all the same, resting on a foundation no wider than a single passing thought. And yet, small as it was, it did not shrink to nothing, and this was the part that eventually let him sleep. However thin the flaw, however momentary, it held. Whatever this thinking was occurring right now, it was occurring, and no demon, however powerful, however total in its deception of everything else, could make it be the case that no thinking was happening while a thinking was in fact happening, because the very attempt to produce that particular illusion would itself have to be a thought arising somewhere for someone or something, and the deception would then simply confirm the one thing it was trying to erase. It was, Illy decided, less like solid ground and more like the flame of a candle in a wind, small, exposed, capable of guttering the instant one stopped attending to it, but real, undeniably real, for as long as it burned. He tried once, half out of curiosity and half out of a lingering unwillingness to let the matter rest, to see whether the same certainty could be extended outward to anyone else, whether he could apply the identical reasoning to his sister, say, and conclude with the same force that she, too, must exist as a thinking thing, given how convincingly she behaved like one. He found, working through it, that he couldn't, not with anything like the same certainty, and that this asymmetry was itself worth sitting with. He could know, directly and immediately, that his own thinking was occurring because he was the one doing it, the one instance in the entire universe he had immediate access to from the inside. But his sister's thinking, if it existed at all, was something he could only ever infer from the outside: her words, her expressions, the particular way she turned her glass of iced tea on the porch railing, and every one of those signs was exactly the sort of thing a demon or a simulation could fabricate without there being any actual thinking behind it at all, a person-shaped absence performing every outward sign of a mind with nothing occurring on the inside of it. He didn't seriously believe his sister was such an absence. It struck him, even turning the thought over, as almost obscene to entertain for more than a moment, a betrayal of every real conversation they'd ever had. But he noticed, and it unsettled him more than he expected, that he had no way of proving otherwise, not with the same iron certainty the cogito had given him about himself. The doubt that had started with his own wakefulness had widened, without his quite meaning it to, into a doubt about everyone else's, and he found that this was a doubt he was far less willing to sit with for long, not because the logic was any weaker, but because some things, he decided, a person is entitled to simply refuse to dwell on, whatever the argument technically permits. For a while, this was almost enough. For a while, the single nail in the wall felt like solid ground, and Elise slept better than he had in the 2 weeks since the whole thing started, because he had, in some sense, won. He had gone looking for a foundation and found one, small as it was. But the peace did not last, because he was not, it turned out, finished with the problem. He had simply moved further down the same tunnel Descartes had opened, and the tunnel, it turned out, kept going long after Descartes himself had put down his pen. In the weeks between the cogito and the lunch, Illy went looking for more recent versions of the demon, half suspecting, correctly as it turned out, that a doubt this fundamental couldn't have simply stopped 400 years ago with one French philosopher and never been touched again. He found that 20th century philosophers had built their own updated version, stripped of anything supernatural, dressed instead in the language of laboratories, a brain, removed from its body, kept alive in a vat of nutrient fluid, its severed nerve endings wired to a bank of machines feeding it electrical signals so precisely calibrated that the brain would experience an entire convincing life, hands, a sky, a childhood, the specific ache of a stubbed toe, without any of it corresponding to an actual body walking through an actual world. The vat had replaced the demon, but the structure underneath was identical, right down to the same unanswerable question: if the brain in the vat could not, from the inside, distinguish its wired existence from a real one, then how could Illy, sitting at his kitchen table, be certain he wasn't the very brain in question, and not the person he assumed himself to be at all? He noticed, working through this version, that the vat had one advantage over the demon that the demon had never needed and never had: plausibility of mechanism. A demon was a supposition, deliberately fantastical, adopted purely as a tool for the exercise of doubt, and no one, least of all Descartes, seriously worried that such a being actually existed. A vat, on the other hand, was disturbingly close to something real neuroscience might one day be capable of building, or something close enough to it that the gap felt more like an engineering problem than a metaphysical impossibility. The doubt hadn't gotten any larger in its logical structure, but it had gotten nearer. He noticed something else, too, reading about the vats, something that would matter later once he reached the simulation argument proper and recognized the same shape arriving for a third time. Each version of the doubt he encountered was, in a strange way, a product of its own historical moment, reaching for whatever machinery that moment found most vivid and most plausible. Descartes, writing in an age still comfortable with spirits and demons and the direct intervention of God in the affairs of the world, had reached for a malevolent genius because that was the kind of powerful, deceptive agent his century found easiest to imagine. The 20th century, newly confident in neuroscience and electrical signaling, had reached for a vat and a bank of wired machines because that was the kind of powerful, deceptive apparatus its own century found easiest to imagine. And his own moment, Illy's moment, awash in computers and processing power and talk of artificial minds, would naturally reach for a simulation, a piece of software, a server somewhere doing the deceiving instead of a spirit or a jar of wide tissue. He found this pattern almost eerie once he saw it clearly, not because it made any of the individual arguments weaker, but because it suggested the doubt itself was something close to permanent, a fixed structural feature of what it is to be a mind capable of reflecting on itself, and that every age simply supplies its own most convincing costume for the same underlying figure to wear. The costume changes. The figure standing inside it, patient and unmoved by fashion, does not. It was his coworker again, the paperback reader, who mentioned it next, almost in passing, the way people mention things that seem obvious to them and startling to everyone else. They were talking about the meditations over lunch again, Illy full of the strange excitement of someone who has just discovered an entire continent of thought he never knew existed, and the co-worker said, "You know, people basically run that same argument today, right? Except instead of a demon, it's a computer." Illy didn't understand at first, and the co-worker explained it the way he understood it, which was rough and second-hand, but enough to send Illy down another rabbit hole that night, this one considerably more modern, considerably more unsettling in a different register. The argument had a name, the simulation argument, and it had been formalized decades after Descartes by a philosopher named Nick Bostrom, though the shape of the idea, Illy would come to see, was really just Descartes' demon wearing new clothes, updated for an age that had computers instead of court sorcerers and metaphysical spirits. The reasoning went something like this, and Illy spent several nights working through it slowly, the way he'd worked through the meditations, because it did not give itself up easily on a first pass. Suppose that civilizations, as they mature technologically, eventually reach a point where they can run extraordinarily detailed simulations of minds' full conscious experiences, indistinguishable from the inside to anything like the experience of actually being a person in a real physical world, running on some future substrate of computation vastly more powerful than anything that existed now. If such a capability is ever reached by any civilization anywhere, and if that civilization has any interest at all in running such simulations for research, for entertainment, for historical reconstruction, for reasons Illy couldn't even imagine yet, thousands of reasons, then the number of simulated conscious minds could vastly outnumber the number of original, biological, real conscious minds, potentially by orders of magnitude, because a single base civilization could in principle run enormous numbers of simulations, each populated with billions of simulated minds over and over indefinitely. And if that is even possible, if the numbers work out that way, then a very strange conclusion follows almost mechanically from simple probability. If you are a conscious mind wondering what kind of mind you are, and simulated minds vastly outnumber original ones, then the sheer weight of numbers makes it more likely than not that you are one of the simulated minds rather than one of the rare originals, not because there's any specific evidence pointing that way, but simply because there are so many more simulated positions to occupy than real ones. Bostrom framed it as a trilemma, not a proof. Either civilizations almost always destroy themselves before reaching that level of technological maturity, or civilizations that reach it almost always choose not to run such simulations for one reason or another, or, and this is the possibility that does the unsettling work, we are almost certainly living in a simulation right now, one of the very many, rather than in the rare, foundational, physical original. He went looking over the next several nights for whatever he could find about where the argument had actually come from and how seriously it was taken by people who had spent their careers thinking about this sort of thing, and he found that it was, if anything, treated with more institutional weight than he'd expected for something that sounded, on the surface, like the plot of a film. Bostrom had laid the trilemma out with the same procedural care Descartes had used centuries earlier, and Illy found something almost funny, in a bleak way, about how the tone of the two arguments matched both men working through catastrophic possibilities with the calm, dry patience of someone filling out a form. The trilemma didn't actually claim that any one of its three branches was true. It claimed only that, given a small number of fairly modest assumptions about the nature of computation and consciousness, at least one of the three had to be, and that there was no obvious way to know in advance which one. Perhaps almost every civilization capable of reaching that level of technology destroys itself first through war, climate, or some catastrophe its own species hadn't yet invented a name for, in which case the simulations are never built and the whole question dissolves. Perhaps civilizations that do survive to that point uniformly lose interest in running such simulations for ethical reasons or because the exercise comes to seem pointless once you can actually do it, in which case, again, the simulations are never built. Or the branch that did the unsettling work, the branch he kept circling back to. Perhaps a large number of these simulations are in fact built over and over by many different civilizations or even by a single civilization many times over, in which case simulated minds would come to vastly outnumber original ones, and a mind with no special evidence pinning it to one category or the other would, on pure probability, be more likely to be one of the many than one of the rare few. He thought about this staircase more than once in the weeks that followed, usually late at night, usually when he was too tired to be doing anything productive with the thought and did it anyway. There was something almost funny about it, in the same bleak register as the trilemma itself, that even the most radical possible discovery, waking up tomorrow with absolute proof that his life ran on someone else's machine, wouldn't actually be the bottom of anything. It would just be one more floor revealed beneath the floor he'd always assumed was the ground, with no way of knowing whether the newly revealed floor was itself the basement or simply another mezzanine in a building whose foundation, if it had one at all, might lie an unknown number of levels further down than any mind trapped on one particular floor could ever hope to see. He found he could not decide whether this made the whole question more or less worth asking. On one hand, it seemed to drain some of the urgency out of it if there was no guaranteed bottom to reach. Then reaching for one at all began to look less like a solvable problem and more like a kind of category error, a demand the universe was never obligated to satisfy. On the other hand, the impossibility of a final floor did nothing to make the current floor any less uncertain, and uncertainty, he had learned across those months, does not particularly care whether the staircase above or below it happens to be finite. He tried to find the argument's weak points, half hoping he would, and found several, though none of them closed the question the way he wanted them to. Some people objected that consciousness might not be the sort of thing you could run on a computer at all, that whatever gives rise to actual first-person experience might depend on the specific physical substrate of the biological brain in a way no simulation, however detailed, could reproduce, so that a simulated person might behave exactly like a conscious person from the outside while having nothing at all going on subjectively behind it. Illy found this objection interesting but ultimately unable to help him, for a reason that took him a while to articulate clearly to himself. Even if it were true, it would only tell him that a simulated version of him couldn't be conscious, and he was quite certain, in the one way he was certain of anything, that whatever he was conscious right now, thinking this very thought. The objection didn't rule out simulated consciousness in general, it just meant that if he was a simulation, something about the argument's usual assumptions would have to be wrong somewhere, without telling him where. Other people made a different move entirely, one that struck him as stranger and, in its way, more interesting than any objection. A philosopher named David Chalmers had argued that even if the whole of his life were running on someone else's computer, this wouldn't actually mean the world wasn't real, only that its underlying nature was computational rather than the kind of matter people usually pictured, that a simulation, if it were detailed and persistent enough, wouldn't be a lesser or fake version of reality so much as simply what reality turned out to be made of, one level down from where anyone inside it could see. This reframing didn't remove Illy's unease so much as redirect it. It wasn't, on this view, a question of real versus fake at all. It was a question of what was underneath, a question that receded the moment you tried to grab it, because even if he somehow confirmed he was in a simulation, he would then have to ask what the simulator's own world was made of, and whether they, too, were being run on something else, and there seemed to be no obvious flaw to that particular staircase either, no guarantee that it terminated anywhere rather than continuing downward indefinitely, simulation within simulation within simulation, an infinite regress with no privileged bottom level anyone could ever actually reach and confirm. What troubled Illy most, more than any single objection, was the peculiar kind of reasoning the argument depended on, reasoning not from evidence in the ordinary sense, not from anything he could see or touch or measure, but from population statistics applied backward onto his own particular case. He had never really encountered this style of argument before, and it took him some time, working through it slowly with the notebook open again, to see why it felt so different from every other kind of doubt he'd wrestled with that year. The dream argument and the demon argument had both worked by attacking the reliability of his experience directly, showing him that the contents of his mind could not certify their own accuracy no matter how vivid or coherent they seemed. The simulation argument worked differently. It didn't attack any particular experience at all. It simply pointed out that if you imagine every conscious mind of a certain type that will ever exist gathered together into one enormous set, and simulated minds hugely outnumber original ones within that set, then a mind with no special information about which category it belongs to should, purely as a matter of honest odds, expect itself to be one of the many rather than one of the few, the same way a person who knows nothing else about themselves except that they are one ticket among a million in a single drawing should not expect, without further evidence, to be the one ticket that wins. He found, reading further, that this style of reasoning had a name, anthropic reasoning, and that it showed up in other unsettling places too, including something called the doomsday argument, which used almost exactly the same logic to suggest that humanity, statistically speaking, is more likely to be somewhere in the middle or latter portion of the total number of humans who will ever live than very near the beginning, simply because there are more possible middle and late positions to occupy than very early ones if the species population continues at anything like its current scale. He didn't find the doomsday argument especially convincing on its own. There was something about the reasoning that felt too clever, too willing to draw large conclusions from an assumption about how to select a random position within a set that hadn't finished being generated yet. But he noticed that his skepticism about the doomsday argument didn't transfer cleanly onto the simulation argument, and he spent a long time trying to work out why, because if the reasoning was flawed, he wanted it to be flawed everywhere it appeared, not just in the version he happened to find less alarming. The best he could do, after turning it over for the better part of a week, was this: the doomsday argument asked him to imagine himself as a random draw from a set that didn't yet fully exist, a set still being generated into an unknown future, which felt like a genuinely strange thing to reason about, since the total size of that set was exactly the unknown quantity in question. The simulation argument was different in a way that mattered. It didn't ask him to imagine a set still being built. It asked a narrower, more local question, given that his own experience right now feels a certain way from the inside, and given that a simulated experience of that same kind would feel identical from the inside with no internal marker distinguishing it, what should he conclude about which kind of experience he was more likely having if simulated experiences of that kind vastly outnumber original ones? This didn't require him to know anything about a still unfolding future. It only required the modest retrospective claim that experiences indistinguishable from the inside can't be told apart by anyone having them, which was, when he really sat with it, just the dream argument and the demon argument again, wearing a new coat, arriving by a different road at the same familiar house. The numbers were new. The vertigo was not. Illy sat with this for a long time, turning it over the way he'd turned over the demon argument weeks earlier, and the resemblance was so exact it startled him almost more than the argument itself did. Descartes' demon, capable of fabricating an entire convincing world of sensation and even manipulating the apparent truths of logic and mathematics themselves, feeding a mind a total, seamless fiction from the inside with no crack anywhere for the deceived mind to find and pry open. The simulation hypothesis, a civilization or an engineer or a research program of immense computational power, capable of fabricating an entire convincing world of sensation, running it on hardware sophisticated enough that the simulated mind inside it would have no internal way of detecting the seam, because the seam, if it existed at all, would live outside the system the mind had any access to. The demon had been metaphysical, almost theological, a kind of malevolent spirit standing outside the order of nature. The simulation was mundane by comparison, almost bureaucratic, not malevolent necessarily, not even particularly interested in Illy specifically, just a piece of infrastructure, a research project, a server humming somewhere in a facility Illy would never see and could never reach, running his entire life and the life of everyone he had ever known as one process among perhaps countless others. And the strange thing was that the mundanity did not make it less unsettling. If anything, it made it worse, because a demon at least implied Illy mattered enough to deceive personally, while a simulation implied nothing of the sort. He might simply be background detail in someone else's research, a non-player character with the misfortune, or perhaps the sheer statistical likelihood, of experiencing his own existence from the inside as though it were the whole of reality. He found, working through the two arguments side by side, notebook open on the kitchen table late into another set of nights, that the logical structure was in fact identical, stripped down to its skeleton. Both arguments start from the same simple observation: a mind's experience, however vivid, however internally consistent, cannot by itself distinguish between being an accurate representation of the world beyond it and being a total fabrication convincingly presented from the inside, because a good enough fabrication would produce exactly the same experience as the truth, feature for feature, with no way for the mind on the inside to check its work against anything outside the fabrication itself. And both arguments arrive at the same strange, narrow island of certainty at the end, the one thing that survives even the worst-case scenario, whatever the content of the experience, whatever is true or false about the sky and the body and the room and the friends and the whole apparent history of a life, there is still, undeniably, an experience happening, a thinking or a perceiving or a doubting going on. And that occurrence, that bare fact of something happening from a first-person point of view, cannot itself be faked away, because faking it away would just be another instance of it happening. The cogito, Illy realized, sitting there with the cold coffee again, a strange echo of that first night now weeks behind him, was not really an argument about demons or dreams or simulations specifically. It was a much more general discovery, one that applied no matter what shape the deception took, no matter how the technology or theology dressed it up, that consciousness, the sheer occurring of experience, is the one thing that survives any possible deception about its content, because the deception itself has to happen to something, and that something's existence as an experiencer is guaranteed by the very act of experiencing anything at all, including the act of being wrong about everything else. This did not resolve the new question the way it had resolved the older one, and Illy understood the difference clearly by now. Knowing that he existed as a thinking thing did nothing to tell him whether he was biological or simulated, whether the body he seemed to have was made of cells or code, whether the world outside his mind was physical matter arranged by physics or information arranged by some process running on hardware built by beings he would never see and could not imagine. The cogito had closed one question completely and left an entirely new, larger question wide open in its place, a question that, unlike the demon, could not simply be dismissed as an imaginative exercise, because, unlike the demon, there were people, actual physicists, actual computer scientists, actual philosophers with actual academic positions, taking the simulation argument seriously as a live possibility rather than a thought experiment designed purely to test the limits of doubt. Descartes had invented his demon and then, by the end of the meditations, more or less argued his way back out of the demon's grip, using a chain of reasoning about the nature of God as a non-deceiver to reclaim, cautiously, the reliability of his senses and the reality of the external world. Illy read that part 2, the long careful climb back up out of doubt into a restored, qualified trust in the world, and found it, if he was honest with himself, the least convincing part of the whole book, a relief the author seemed to need more than the argument seemed to earn. The simulation hypothesis offered no equivalent ladder back out. There was no theological argument waiting at the end of it to reassure him that his simulator, if one existed, was benevolent, or even attentive, or even aware of him as anything more than a data point in a very large distributed process. There was one more evening that mattered, one Uli would come back to more often than any of the books, more even than the notebook full of failed tests. A flyer at the library had caught his eye a few weeks into all of this, a public lecture at the university across town, open to anyone, on the subject of skepticism and the philosophy of mind, given by a professor whose name meant nothing to him at the time. He went on impulse, sat near the back of a half-full lecture hall that smelled faintly of old carpet and whiteboard cleaner, and listened to a small, precise woman in her 60s walk a room of mostly undergraduates through exactly the terrain he had been stumbling across alone for weeks, except with none of the stumbling, every step placed with the calm confidence of someone who had walked this ground 1,000 times before and no longer found it frightening, only interesting. Afterward, against every instinct he had, he stayed behind and approached her at the small table near the door where she was gathering her notes, and asked with more urgency in his voice than he'd intended whether any of it, the dream doubt, the demon, all of it, actually got resolved eventually, whether there was some later chapter of the history of philosophy where someone had finally closed the door for good. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite place, somewhere between amusement and recognition, the look of someone who has seen this particular species of urgency walk up to her table before and knows exactly what it means. "No," she said simply, not unkindly. "Not in the way you want it closed. People have proposed all sorts of ways to live with it. Some think the doubt is technically unanswerable but practically irrelevant. Some think it's actually incoherent to worry about once you look closely at what proof would even mean here. Some think it's just a permanent feature of being a mind that can reflect on itself. But nobody's found the key that unlocks it for good. I'd be suspicious of anyone who told you they had." She asked him, then gently, how long he'd been sitting with it, and when he told her, several weeks, sleeping badly, testing light switches, she nodded slowly, as though this too was familiar territory, and said something he wrote down in the notebook the moment he got home, word for word, because he didn't trust himself to remember it accurately otherwise. "The mistake most people make with this isn't taking it seriously. It's expecting it to resolve like a puzzle, with an answer at the back of the book. It doesn't resolve. You just eventually stop needing it to." He didn't fully understand what she meant that night, driving home with the windows down, the ordinary city passing by in its ordinary way, streetlights and traffic and a radio playing something he wasn't really listening to. He understood it better months later, and it is, in its way, the closest thing this story has to a moral, if a story like this can be said to have one at all. He asked her one more question before she gathered the last of her notes and the room emptied out around them, something that had been sitting under everything else he'd asked, half-formed until it finally found its way out. "If none of it ever resolves," he said, "if there's no key, no final chapter, then what was the point of any of it? The dream argument, the demon, 400 years of people running the same doubt through their hands and setting it back down unsolved. Wasn't that just despair with better vocabulary? She considered this longer than she'd considered anything else he'd asked, long enough that he wondered if he'd overstepped, and then she told him that she thought the point wasn't the destination at all, but the particular kind of attention the doubt forces a person to pay on the way through it to things they would otherwise have walked straight past without a second glance, the weight of a hand, the specific gold of a particular evening's light, the sheer strangeness of there being any experience at all rather than nothing. You don't do this, she said, to arrive somewhere. You do it because doing it changes what it's like to already be here, wherever here turns out to be. He didn't have an answer for that, and didn't try to find one, and simply thanked her and walked back out to his car under a sky he no longer knew with any certainty how to categorize, and found, a little to his own surprise, that he didn't mind not knowing nearly as much as he had a few months earlier. He mentioned all of this to his co-worker again, weeks after the first lunchtime conversation that had sent him toward Descartes in the first place, and the co-worker, who by now seemed both pleased and faintly alarmed by what he'd started, asked him the obvious question, the one Illy had been circling without quite letting himself land on it. Did any of this actually change anything about how he lived? Illy didn't have a ready answer. He thought about it for several days afterward, turning the question over the way he'd turned over the tests and the arguments, and found that the honest answer split in two directions at once, both true, neither cancelling the other out. In one sense nothing changed at all, and had to change at all, because whatever the ultimate nature of the floor beneath him, biological or simulated, dreamed or demon-fed, the floor still had to be walked on in exactly the same way, one step after another. Rent still needed paying, the specific ache of missing his father was still exactly as sharp, whatever substrate it was running on, and no metaphysical uncertainty, however total, released him from any of the ordinary obligations of a Tuesday. He still went to work. He still watered the plant on his windowsill that his sister had given him and that he had a long history of nearly killing. In another sense, though, something had shifted permanently, something quieter and harder to name, and it had nothing to do with resolving the question and everything to do with no longer being able to pretend the question wasn't there. He thought during this stretch of weeks a great deal about what it would actually mean, practically, for any of this to be true, and found that the honest answer was probably very little would change, and that this itself was strange to sit with. If he was living in a simulation, the simulation was, by every available test, completely convincing. The pain of a pinch, the sting of it, the crooked angle of the Henderson's car, the specific weight of his coffee mug in his hand, the way grief had felt 3 years earlier when his father died, all of it rendered with a fidelity that made the question of its ultimate substrate almost, though not quite, irrelevant to how he had to live inside it. He still had to go to work in the morning. He still had to pay rent, whatever rent ultimately turned out to be made of, at whatever level of reality it was tracked. The pain of the pinch had still hurt, whatever medium it had hurt in. And yet something had changed, something real and lasting that had nothing to do with resolving the metaphysical question and everything to do with having actually looked at it directly instead of letting the 3 a.m. thought dissolve the way it usually would have. He no longer took the floor for granted. He no longer assumed, the way he had assumed without ever noticing he was assuming it, that the world simply was what it appeared to be, world without further question, the way most people move through their days. There was, alongside this, a quieter effect he hadn't anticipated and found harder to describe to his sister or his co-worker when they asked how he was doing, months in. The doubt, once it had run its full course through him, seemed to leave behind not despair but a strange, unearned kind of attentiveness, the sort of noticing usually reserved for things about to be lost. He found himself, on ordinary evenings, looking at ordinary things, the particular gold of late light coming through his kitchen window, the sound of his own front door closing, the exact specific weight of his sister's hand on his shoulder when she said goodbye at the end of a visit with an intensity he hadn't brought to any of it before that first sleepless night. He wasn't sure whether this was wisdom or merely a kind of nervous overcorrection, a mind trying to compensate for the vertigo of not knowing what any of it ultimately was by paying closer attention to what it seemed from the inside to be. But he noticed it, and he found, on balance, that he didn't want it to go away even on the nights it kept him awake a little longer than he would have liked. It felt, more than the tests ever had, like a kind of proof of something, even if it wasn't proof of the thing he'd originally gone looking for. He had gone looking, foolishly, almost by accident, for a way to prove he was awake, and what he had found instead, after weeks of failed tests and half-remembered rumors about text and light switches, after Descartes and the demon and the strange cold comfort of the cogito, after Bostrom's trilemma settling over him like a fog that never quite lifted, was that the question could not be answered from the inside, not with certainty, not ever, by him or by Descartes or by anyone, and that this was not, in the end, the catastrophe it had felt like at 4 in the morning 3 weeks earlier. It was simply the shape of the situation every thinking thing is actually in, whether it notices or not. Most people never notice. They wake, and the door closes on its own weight, and the day begins, and the question never gets asked. There is a particular evening, some months after all of this began, that Elise still thinks of as the closest thing he ever got to an ending, though he's careful, even in his own mind, not to call it a resolution, because nothing was actually resolved. He was sitting on his sister's porch again, the same porch, a different season, and she asked him, half joking by then, whether he'd finally made his peace with not knowing. He told her the truth, which was that he wasn't sure peace was quite the right word for it, but that something in the shape of the fear had changed. In the beginning, the not knowing had felt like standing on a trapdoor, waiting for it to open, the entire dread of the thing concentrated in the possibility of a future moment when the floor would finally give way and the truth, whatever it was, would come crashing in on him all at once. But the months had gone by and the trapdoor had never opened, and somewhere in that stretch of ordinary, ongoing, unresolved time he had come to understand that it was never going to open, not because the questions had been answered, but because that was never how this kind of question worked. There was no future moment of revelation waiting for him. There was only this, the going forward without the answer, which was, he realized, and which he suspected Descartes himself must eventually have realized too, despite the confident architecture of the book's later pages, actually the entire condition, the whole of it, not a temporary state on the way to something more settled. His sister asked him, that same evening, whether he ever wished he'd never picked up the book in the first place, never let the 3 a.m. thoughts sit there instead of rolling over and letting it dissolve the way it always had before. He thought about it seriously before answering, because it deserved a serious answer and not the easy, grateful one he might have given a few months earlier. There had been real cost to it, the bad sleep, the weeks of low static running under every ordinary moment, the strange distance it had briefly put between him and the unexamined comfort he used to take for granted in simple things like a bowl of cereal or a handshake. He didn't pretend otherwise. But he told her, in the end, that no, he didn't wish it away, and that the closest he could come to explaining why was to say that he no longer felt like a man standing in a house without knowing where the walls were. He still didn't know where the walls were, not really, not with certainty. But he had, at least, gone and looked for them directly, with his own hands, in the dark, rather than simply trusting that they were there because it had never once occurred to him to check. There was a difference, he thought, between an untested comfort and a comfort that had been pushed on hard by every argument he could find or invent, and had still, somehow, in its own thin and flickering way held. He still, on certain nights, catches himself running the old tests without quite meaning to, glancing at a clock twice, reading a street sign, pinching absently at the back of his hand while waiting for a bus, old habits that never fully left him, small ritual gestures that no longer carry the desperate weight they once did. He knows now, in the calm and almost affectionate way you know an old joke, that none of them will ever settle anything, that no light switch or aspirin label or double-checked clock face was ever going to hand him the kind of proof he'd originally gone looking for at 4 in the morning that first night. What he has instead, he thinks, is something smaller and stranger and, in its own way, sturdier than proof, the plain, recurring fact of noticing that he is thinking, over and over, thought after thought, each one arriving with no external guarantee attached to it and none needed because the guarantee was never going to come from outside. It was always going to have to come, if it came at all, from the bare fact of the thinking itself. He thinks sometimes about the professor's line, the one about not expecting a puzzle's answer at the back of the book, and finds that it applies to more of his life now than he expected it to when he first heard it, sitting in that half-empty lecture hall. He had always assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that the big questions worked the way school problems worked. You struggled with them for a while, and then, if you were diligent or lucky or both, you arrived at the answer, and the struggling stopped and you moved on carrying the answer with you like a completed homework assignment. What he learned that year, slowly and at some real cost to his sleep, was that at least some questions aren't shaped like that at all. They're shaped more like weather or a chronic, low-grade ache in an old injury not solve exactly but live with, sometimes flaring, sometimes fading almost to nothing, never fully gone. He isn't sure this counts as wisdom. It might just be exhaustion that has learned to describe itself more generously. But it is, at least, honest, and honesty, he has come to think, might be worth more than the false comfort of a solved puzzle anyway. There is an odd kind of company in it, too, one he didn't expect to find. He thinks on the nights the old restlessness comes back, of Descartes at his own table by his own fire 400 years earlier, working through the identical vertigo with a quill instead of a notebook, and of the philosopher named Bostrom laying out his trilemma with the same patient procedural calm centuries later, and of Juinzi waking from the butterfly with no way of knowing which side of the dream he'd actually been standing on, and of a small precise woman in a lecture hall telling a stranger that no, it doesn't close, not really, and that this was all right. None of them solved it either. That, oddly, is the closest thing to comfort he has found in the whole affair, not an answer, but the company of everyone else who ever looked as hard as he did and came back as he did, still not knowing, and found a way to live inside the not knowing anyway. He still falls asleep most nights to the low murmur of a television run he's already seen a dozen times, the same habit he had before any of this started, and there is something he finds quietly moving about that, though he'd struggle to explain exactly why if his sister asked him to put it into words. The habit survived. The ordinary comfort of it survive, whatever surviving, in the end, actually turns out to mean for a thing that might be running on hardware he will never see, in a facility he will never visit, inside a reality he has no way of confirming from where he sits. He turns the television off eventually most nights and lies in the dark, and sometimes, in the last moments before sleep takes him, the old question drifts up one more time, quieter now, almost gentle, worn smooth by however many months of handling. What if this is a dream? And these days, more often than not, he simply lets it sit there beside him instead of chasing it, the way you might let a familiar animal settle at the foot of the bed, neither answered nor argued with, just present, breathing quietly in the dark alongside him until sleep, whatever sleep ultimately is, comes and takes them both. Ellie still doesn't know, and expects now that he never will, whether the room he is sitting in is a room, or a rendering, or a dream inside some other sleeper's longer dream, or a demon's careful theatre, or a simulation running quietly in a facility on the other side of a reality he has no access to and no way of reaching. What he knows, the one thing, the single nail in the wall, the thing that survived every test that failed and every argument that widened the doubt instead of closing it, is that something is doing the wondering. Something is here, thinking this thought, right now, uncertain of almost everything except the bare fact of its own uncertainty. And on the nights when the old 3 a.m. feeling comes creeping back, the sense of standing in that doorway again, watching it refuse to close, he no longer reaches for the pinch, or the light switch, or the aspirin bottle read twice. He simply notices the thought occurring, and lets that be enough, because it is the only thing he has come to understand that ever really was.